Why do some men, as they grow older, to begin to speak less, not just in words, but in desire? In youth, connection was loud, urgent. It was written in gestures, in glances, in pursuit. But something begins to fade not in strength, but in meaning. By their 60s, many men no longer chase what once defined them, not because they've given up, but because they've begun to understand something deeper. You might notice it in the silence between conversations, in the way he sits by the window longer, watching the light shift across the floor, or how he finds peace in stillness, in simplicity, in being present. This isn't about loss, it's about change, a quiet transformation that speaks without noise. Some call it withdrawal, others awakening. But for many men, choosing quiet over craving is not an end. It's a turning inward, toward peace, toward reflection. But to understand how they arrived at this silence, we need to look back to the years when intensity shaped identity, when connection was the fire that lit everything. Let's begin there. There was a time when everything felt urgent. In the early years, our 20s, our 30s, even into our 40s, life pulsed with a kind of electricity. Every glance held possibility, every conversation, a hidden meaning. Connection wasn't just a part of life, it was the pulse itself. For many men, these years were shaped by drive, a hunger to build, to conquer, to prove. Strength was measured not only in action, but in attention. Being wanted meant being worthy. Being active meant being alive. There was a fire in the bloodstream, testosterone surging like an engine that never cooled. Late nights didn't drain us. They fed us. The pursuit was exciting, affirming, and endlessly consuming. These weren't just moments of desire. They were confirmations of identity. To be a man was to move forward, to chase, to never slow down. It was in this intensity that many built their confidence, their sense of purpose, their rhythm of life. Even love, for some, was expressed more through energy than through stillness. And so, for decades, the idea of slowing down felt almost impossible. To pause meant to fall behind. To stop meant to disappear. But time doesn't ask permission to move. Eventually, the engine kits, the pace softens, and what once defined the day begins to fade into the background. There's no clear moment when the change begins. It doesn't come with a warning, but one day, the reflection in the mirror looks a little different. The urgency softens. The need to prove becomes a whisper instead of a roar. And suddenly, the chase that once brought meaning starts to feel unfamiliar. We begin to listen to a different kind of silence. A silence that says, things are changing. Now, till we enter the next chapter, not of loss, but of transformation. The body, once a vessel of tireless energy, begins to whisper of change. It doesn't happen overnight, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the edges of strength begin to soften. Mornings feel heavier. Sleep becomes lighter. Recovery takes longer than it used to. Where once there was certainty, there's now hesitation. Hormones decline. Quietly but steadily. Muscles respond more slowly. Fatigue visits more often. And then come the quiet companions of aging: elevated blood pressure, stiff joints, lingering back pain. Nothing dramatic, just different. At first, it's easy to explain away. Just a long week, just stress, just a bad night's sleep. But as the seasons pass, those explanations wear thin, and something deeper sets in. A man begins to notice the disconnect between how he once felt and how he feels now. What was once automatic now takes effort. Confidence begins to waver, and with it, a kid doubt takes root. He starts speaking less, not just to others, but to himself, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it would mean confronting the truth, that the image he once held of himself is slipping, that he's no longer the force he used to be. And so, silence becomes safer, easier than explaining, easier than trying. Easier than facing the mirror and wondering where that younger man went. This isn't weakness. It's self-preservation, a silent retreat from expectation, from comparison, from disappointment. It's not that the desire disappears entirely. It's that the body no longer meets it halfway. And in that gap, many choose stillness over struggle. But the story doesn't end there. Because while the body begins to change, so does something else. Something even more intimate. The nature of connection itself, what once centered around energy, now starts to move towards something quieter, something deeper. And so, the shift continues. Not just in muscle or strength, but in relationship. Let's go there next. As years pass, something in the relationship begins to shift. It's not a sudden break, not a moment of crisis. More often, it's a quiet unfolding, a gentle transition from passion to presence, from fire to familiarity. What once revolved around physical closeness slowly gives way to a different kind of bond. The early years were marked by intensity. Affection came with urgency. Conversations turned into long nights. Eyes met with intention. But now, the rhythm is slower. The gestures are smaller. The days begin to blend into patterns. They share a home, a routine, a life built on decades of shared responsibilities and memories. They know each other's habits. They finish each other's sentences. There's comfort in the familiar, but also, sometimes, a silence that lingers a little too long. For many couples, intimacy becomes less about touch and more about understanding. But for some, the transition is not easy. It begins with small distance skipped conversations, separate bedtimes, missed glances. What was once spontaneous now feels scheduled. What once felt natural now requires effort. They become companions more than partners. Friendly, but not always close. United, but not always connected. And for many men, this quiet drift feels heavier than they expected. He may not say it out loud, but he feels it. The weight of routine, the dullness of repetition, the ache of something unsaid. There's no conflict, no harsh words, just a growing gap between two people who once held each other a little tighter. And so, he begins to withdraw, not because he no longer cares, but because he's tired. Tired of trying to reignite something that feels out of reach. Tired of feeling invisible in his own home. Tired of not knowing how to bridge the silence. In this stage, many men choose quiet, not as surrender, but as self-protection. He walks the house without speaking. He listens, but doesn't share. He nods, but doesn't open up. It's not bitterness. It's fatigue. Not resentment, but resignation. And yet, this isn't where the story ends. Because not all silence is a retreat. Some men, amid the quiet, begin to feel something new. A shift not just in the relationship, but within themselves. They're not grieving what's lost. They're discovering something else. Something deeper. Something unexpected. And while one chapter quietly closes, another begins. Written in stillness, reflection, and clarity. Let's turn the page. Not all silence is sadness. For some men, silence becomes sanctuary. There comes a point often later in life when the pursuit fades. The need to chase, to prove, to conquer, begins to dissolve. Not out of defeat, but from a quiet realization that peace was never found out there. It was always waiting within. These men begin to turn inward. They rise early, not because they must, but because they want to hear the birds, to feel the morning sun spill through the curtains, to drink their coffee slowly, without noise, without rush. They walk without headphones. They read without distraction. They sit beneath trees, not looking for anything, just being. There's no longer urgency in their movements. Their energy isn't scattered across a dozen needs. It gathers, it grounds, it rests. They no longer seek attention. They seek clarity. The outer world becomes quieter because the inner world has become richer. They don't speak as much, not because they have nothing to say, but because they found comfort in what doesn't need to be said. They are no longer defined by what they can do, or what they once had. They are defined by presence, by simplicity, by awareness. What once drove them ambition, competition, desire has softened, not vanished, but transformed. And in that space where noise used to live, something else emerges: stillness, balance, freedom. There is a kind of liberation in letting go of the old script, in realizing that being alive does not mean being constantly in motion. In this stage, some men don't feel loss. They feel return. Return to self. Return to breath. Return to the quiet dignity of simply existing, without explanation. They meditate, not for performance, but for presence. They choose nature over nightlife, depth over drama, enough over excess. To the outside world, it may look like they've slowed down, but internally, they've never been more awake. They are no longer fighting for identity. They are resting in it. And in that rest, they find peace far greater than the thrill that once defined their youth. But this is not every man's story, because while some arrive at silence through self-awareness, others arrive through heartbreak, through weariness, through feeling unheard. And so, we shift again, from silence chosen to silence, born of pain. Not all silence comes from peace. Some silence is built from absence, from the quiet ache of being unseen. For many men, especially as the years go on, a different kind of loneliness begins to settle in. It doesn't shout. It doesn't cry out for help. It just sits quietly in the background of their days. They may live with others, share meals, smile in photographs, but inside, there's often a distance no one notices, a space between what they feel and what they're allowed to say, because somewhere along the way, they were taught to hold it in, to stay strong, to carry their doubts in silence, to solve everything quietly and never become a burden. And so they do. They stay composed. They speak less. They laugh on cue. But inside, it gets heavy. They're not cold. They're not distant. They're just tired of explaining what no one seems to hear. The world rarely asks men how they feel, and even when it does, few believe the answer will be welcome. So they protect themselves with silence. They numb the noise with distraction, and over time, even they begin to forget what they once needed to say. What looks like indifference is often grief. What looks like disinterest is often disappointment. Behind the quiet eyes of many older men is a history of giving more than they received, of staying strong when they needed softness, of being reliable, even when they were falling apart. And yet, despite this loneliness, they go on, not bitter, not angry, just frustil. But not all silence remains hollow, because eventually, some men learn to reshape it, to turn quiet into comfort, to find a different way to connect. And in that transformation, silence becomes not a wall, but a bridge. Let's step onto that bridge now. At some point, silence is no longer a response to pain. It becomes a decision. For these men, quiet is no longer a hiding place. It is where they feel most themselves. It's not emptiness. It's clarity. They no longer speak to be heard. They speak when it matters, and listen more than ever before. Connection no longer depends on words, or on what is done. It's in the glance across the dinner table, the steady hand placed gently on a shoulder, the presence that fills the room without sound. This stage of life doesn't seek validation. It seeks truth. Not performance, but presence. For many men, what used to be about pursuit has become about being aware, being kind, being grounded, being here. And in this quiet, something beautiful happens. Relationships shift. They no longer revolve around proving or achieving. They become spaces of calm, of safety, of deep mutual recognition. Even intimacy, once loud, filled with expectations, now takes on a quieter form. It lives in eye contact, in shared stillness, in trust that doesn't need to be spoken to be known. There is no race to impress, no pressure to meet an image, only a steady understanding. I'm here, with you, as I am. Who won? This kind of silence is not absence. It's presence at its most powerful, and for many men, it is the most honest form of connection they've ever known. But is this experience purely personal? A quiet evolution felt only within? Or has science already begun to see what these men are living? Let's step back and ask the researchers, the sociologists, the psychologists. What do they say about this shift? Is it a matter of age, of biology, or is it something far deeper? Let's find out. This quiet transformation that many men experience in later life, it's not just a feeling, it's been studied, measured, observed. In recent surveys across the United States, over 40% of men over the age of 60 reported a noticeable decline in interest in physical intimacy. Not due to illness, not due to inability, but because their priorities had changed. Psychologists point to a combination of biological and emotional factors. Biologically, hormone levels naturally shift with age. Testosterone decreases, energy levels fluctuate. The body no longer sends the same signals it once did. But the mind also evolves with time. Many men begin to redefine what connection means. It's no longer about proving attraction or chasing validation. It becomes about feeling seen, safe, accepted. Sociologists suggest that this change isn't just physical, it's cultural. Men who spent decades being told to lead, to perform, to be strong are now, finally, stepping into a phase where being present matters more than being impressive. This isn't a rejection of closeness. It's a redefinition of it. Rather than fast-paced expressions, connection is now sought in quieter ways. A shared meal, a walk with no destination, a conversation with no goal beyond listening. Researchers emphasize that this isn't a loss, it's an evolution, a shift from intensity to intimacy, from noise to nuance. So when a man in his 60s or 70s begins to grow quieter, it doesn't always mean something is wrong. In many cases, it means he's finally listening to himself and perhaps, for the first time, understanding what truly brings him peace. But if you're in this phase, or if you love someone who is, what should you do? How can you meet this change with grace and connection? Let's explore that next. If you find yourself in this season of silence, pause for a moment, not to judge it, but to understand it. Ask yourself quietly, am I withdrawing from life or returning to myself? Is this silence a shield or a doorway? There's no shame in stepping back, but there is wisdom in knowing why. For many men, this chapter brings clarity, but for others, it brings confusion. The difference often lies in how honestly we're willing to listen to our own needs. And if you're walking beside someone who's grown quieter, a husband, a partner, a father, know this. Their silence isn't always distance. Sometimes it's simply a new language they've learned to speak. Avoid assumptions. Avoid asking only, "What's wrong?" Instead, try asking, "What do you need right now? What helps you feel close to me?" And more than anything, listen without rushing to fix. Connection in this stage doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't always come through action. Often, it's built in the calm moments, a shared morning, a hand resting quietly, a presence that says, "I'm here, and I see you." Oh, when we stop expecting love to always look the same, we begin to notice the ways it's still there, growing quietly beneath the surface. Because not all closeness is expressed in words, and not all love is measured by intensity. Sometimes, what matters most is simply being willing to stay. But in the end, maybe the question isn't how to fix the silence. Maybe the real answer lies in learning how to accept it. Let's close with that thought. Silence can mean many things. It can mark the end of something once vibrant, or the beginning of something more honest. It can feel like distance, or arrive as wisdom. For some, it signals letting go. For others, it's the first moment of truly arriving. At this stage in life, The noise of the world grows softer, and what remains is choice. So ask yourself, in this moment, are you still chasing what once defined you, or have you found peace in simply being who you are now? At this age, would you rather fill the room with sound, or sit comfortably in your own silence? Ticking clock fades in, dark screen, final whisper. Are you living true to yourself, or just continuing the habit of who you used to be?